Alex Linares, welcome to Unbroken.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being here with me. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and how you heard about the three principles?
Sure. Um, yeah, I love reflecting on this question because I feel like it changes every time that I kind of look back there, right? And see how did I get here? So background, I am a scientist, professionally, been in research for a very long time and just have always been a really curious person since my earliest memories was always around just finding out how things worked and where things came from and just really trying to understand. And I think that kind of translated into my professional life, looking into the scientific world, moving in that direction, but also into the seeking side that started really early on for me from the earliest years of being in Sunday school and kind of that religious learning. It wasn't a passive thing for me. It was a very active interaction that I had with that knowledge and the information that was being provided, and really questioning what was coming my way and kind of looking around and realizing that not a lot of people, that were 6, 7 years old were doing that. So yeah, it was just really interesting that it became a really big identity for me really early on that, oh, I feel like I need to know more than others do. I feel like others are okay with a certain threshold and of knowing, and they're happy with that. And I never really felt like I reached that. So I think it's kind of permeated my whole history. Um and in that same kind of path, I encountered kind of, I went through the religious and path and looking at different types of religions, kind of comparing and contrasting, right? That we do a lot when we look at the Western religions, the Eastern religions, and through that, a lot of the philosophies and a lot of the things that kept coming up, the same themes were so interesting to me. Like, oh, like it seemed like we were all pointing at the same thing, right? And we had different life experiences and words and histories, and just the beauty of seeing the similarities across all of that just became something really fascinating and very unifying for me, and to the point where I didn't feel the need to find the one kind of dogma or the one method that would work for me, just because I felt that it was all pointing in the same direction. Um, which I think fits right into the three principles, right? That part of this of your question, which is the three principles really brought that all together in a very secular way, which was really interesting, but in a very deep spiritual felt sense, which I was very unique, right? Because I think psychology has tried to do that. A lot of the Buddhist kind of meditation psychology has tried to do it, but the three P's just had a different spin to it, and I just really it really resonated. It came to me at the right time in my life, which was actually through Amy Johnson. um, I read her book end of 2020. All the things were happening, not just the pandemic. I was moving out of state and reestablishing my life in a completely different place. And it really felt like a different planet late 2020 in terms of what life looked like, and what the world I thought I was moving into versus what it was. And it just really resonated for me, to just see the simplicity of experience as mind and thought, and just really being able to have a tangible word for experience and the manifestation of experience. So that's how I came to find the three principles. It's mentioned in Amy Johnson's book, Dr. Amy Johnson's book, Little Book of Big Change, in passing. It's not very, it's not really a three principles book, but then I, of course, I caught it and I started looking into it, and then I started reading a lot of the Sydney Banks work and a lot of the other three principle practitioners. So it really opened up a whole world of speaking again about the same thing, the same kind of um, unknowable experience, but the language really resonated with me.
And so many people who are guests on the show were searching for a specific answer to a question or trying to heal themselves from something when they went on that search. Was that the same for you?
What's interesting, yeah, it definitely was. I mean, and it's very specifically to Amy, like how I found Amy Johnson, and the three principles was around eating, right? There
Mm,
was this kind of big, heavy eating thing that seemed like an issue, and I needed to find solutions. And so that was definitely the portal there. Uh, but when I reflect back and I really look at what preceded a lot of the issues that I was trying to fix, it was always this like more generic emptiness of like I'm missing something. There was this very early on, I just had this sense of like there's something more here that I'm missing. And I think that kind of longing, that emptiness then turned into, oh, I need to fix my food issues, or I need to be more disciplined, or I need to be a better parent. Like I've seen how it's changed, but because I think it's because it was so early for me as a child, I remember that there was this like non-content longing, um, that then obviously the mind filled with and still fills with plenty of content for me to chase and fix.
right. Yeah. And speaking of this, you mentioned on your website that you had three big insights that changed the trajectory of your life. Could you share those with us, please?
Yeah. Yeah, I just have a big smile on my face when I think about that because it's just been such a beautiful experience to have a sense of expansion, and sometimes that expansion feels like progression, right? Because I want
Mhm.
to give it a direction, and I want to feel like I'm getting somewhere. But what it's been is just this kind of um clarifying of orientation is the way I will put it. So when I first started searching, uh, it really felt like whatever words and images were in my head, that's who I was, right? Like I'm this thinking, right? I'm these words, I'm these images, and and then in those first kind of years, realizing like, oh, I'm not my thoughts, right? Kind of like when we think of something like Byron Katie, right? Which was, the work was one of those big portals for me. um and just realizing like how obvious, right, that like I wasn't my thoughts, right? There's some activity up here, seemingly around my head, and then I've identified with it. Interesting. And then moving into like, well, then what is this body that feels, right, without language? What is this body that goes towards and away? And then realizing that I was then identifying with that as this body that was solid and was moving, and reacting to the world. And then when I looked at that closer, realizing that that wasn't that either, right? Like I wasn't the thinking, and then almost like I'm thinking with my body, like that's kind of an extension of thought, right? Which is um kind of a huge opening for a lot of people. And then I was left with like, who am I in the world, right? Like I'm obviously acting, and it feels like I'm affecting other people, and then I must be my behaviors, right? I must be the activity of being out in the world. And then realizing how arbitrary that is, who I am out in the world is through the filter of who I think I am, through the thoughts, through the feelings, and then just having all that collapse. Like, wow, if I'm not what I'm thinking, and I'm not what I'm feeling, and I'm not what I'm doing, what am I? And there's there's not a lot that comes back from that question. I don't know. And I think that's the point, right? Like I feel like when we really shed a lot of that, then there's not a lot of questions left, I guess, when those things are kind of obvious and self-evident.
And, was there an experience of this may seem like an odd question, but was there an experience of grief when you realized you weren't your thoughts, you weren't your feelings, you weren't your behavior out in the
Oh.
world? Was there a sense of loss?
Oh, that's huge. And I think we don't talk about that enough, not as coaches and not in this, because there was a huge there was a huge wave of grief, and there still are every time that I realize that something that I identified with is not it, whatever it is. There is this grief, and it's a sadness of, there's a little bit of like, "Oh, I spent so much time doing that and thinking that, and yeah, yeah, yeah," like all of that. But there's also this like it's almost this vacuum
Mm,
of like, "Oh, life want like something, it wants to be filled with something, with more information. Like if I'm not this, I'm that." And "Oh, look at that. You should have done this earlier." And like, but then there's just this vacuum. And I think that is what for me is the grief, is that open space that sometimes just wants to remain empty. And we have so much momentum into not having that emptiness be, that it has this kind of, going back to that word, that longing, that sadness, that there's a little bit of a tinge of sadness to it for a bit, sometimes for a long bit. But yeah, I love that you bring that up, because I've coached quite a few people that feel like something's gone wrong, right, with
mhm,
that, because they're like, "Well, I thought this was gonna be unicorns and rainbows. Like I've been investing money and time and in my entire life, and then all of a sudden it's lighter, life is lighter, things feel clearer perhaps, and I'm sad, or I miss it, or there's but is this and, right? And I think if we point to like, yes, and you're gonna feel that because that's the full experience of being alive. Um, I think it can really help. It can really help.
mm. Yeah, oh, good, okay, yeah, thank you for saying that, I appreciate hearing your take on that very much. Um, you have a blog post on your site where you say that all we ever are is memory, and I'd love for you to expand on that and tell us what you see in that.
Yeah. Oh, that's like a fresh one for me.
Mhm.
This was actually, I was, one of those YouTube rabbit holes that one can get into. And I was listening, I was cleaning or doing something, and it was Jay Krishnamurti was just having one of his big talks, and he said, thought is a function of memory. And I slowed me down a little bit, and I was like, thought is a function of memory. Okay, I can follow that, right? Like, in order to have a thought that is known, there has to be information somewhere, right? That then is a thought, right? A coherent thought. So I was like, I can follow that. And then he said, and everything that we can know is memory. And I had to really slow down with that. And then my mind went to, okay, I'm going to find the exception. What is in memory? And you can try it yourself. I actually highly encourage that you try it yourself. Like you cannot find anything that can be known that is not memory, because everything
Mm.
has been learned. The shapes, the colors, the just even the sense of knowing, the idea of this is sight versus this is touch, all that has been learned, and not like actively like sit down in a classroom learned, but it has been how we've learned to be human, how we've learned to be people that move in this material world. And it was so tangible, like, because when when we can say it out loud and say, "Oh, everything's memory," um, it sounds a bit like, I don't know about that, like, but really sit with it, like, what you're holding in your hand right now, that this pen that I'm holding is only memory, because I remember um, what a pen feels like, right? Like, what it looks like, the shape of it, the colors of it, what I do with it. Like, I can't hold a pen in its raw experience. I don't know how to anymore, because I've learned how to, re-experience my memory as thought.
Mhm. Wow, yeah, it's such a profound idea, and it has me thinking about things like when people lose their memory, if they have
Mhm.
amnesia or Alzheimer's or something like that, and what's left. There is an essence, of course, of the person
Yeah.
that's still there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And that essence, what I and, when I think of remembering who we are, right? We have to remember who we are. Um, and we know that when we see, those, cases where someone loses, either part of their, function of their brain, or there's some kind of malfunction, they will lose their personality, right? And
Yeah.
some essential things and that's a huge grief process for the families. Like, where did that person go? And
Mhm.
that to me that's fascinating, and it points to that, right? Who we are, this continuous person, is based on memory, which is very fragile, as we know, right? Because it seems to be contained in this brain. Um, and then there is this essence, and that essence tends to be very immediate. It doesn't reference back a lot. And I think that's what we're always kind of searching for, is that, "Oh, what am I when I don't have to remember who I am
Mm.
or who I need to be?" Yeah.
Yeah, and I even think about when we have thoughts about the future, like if there are things that are not memories, and I'm specifically thinking about anxiety, it still really is a memory because we
Mhm.
we are we're getting anxious about something that happened in the past, and we often think we're worried about something that could happen in the future, but really we're worried about something we think could happen again in the future.
Yeah.
That's where we go with our thoughts about anxiety.
That's huge. Like, seeing that the future is memory, it,
Yes.
like, blows your mind, because
Yes.
it can't be anything else, right? Like, that's why, like, when you look at it, it's fun, because you're like, "What else would it be if it's not memory? I wouldn't be able to know it." And, I think we've all had that experience, like, you're going about your day and someone says something and you had, like, nothing in you. It wasn't in your universe to worry about, and you're like, "Oh, now I get to worry about that," right? And
Right.
it's interesting, like, because all of a sudden that becomes part of your memory, but a second before, that was nowhere in your universe to be projected as a worry into the future. So it's just kind of interesting to see that our past, our present, as in a tangible, like, this is who I am right now, and the future is all just kind of a function of memory.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I'm gonna be playing with that for a little while, for sure, I can tell. Yeah. And you also have a mention on your website about how liberating it is to know that we can't get it right. I'd love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, this is one that I've been playing around with a lot, and actually we had a wonderful call today, with a small group, and this came up. And it's this little sneaky story that we learn early on, that there is a kind of rubric, or some kind of master plan, or some kind of endpoint that makes our life right, or worthwhile, or, yeah, just and it was really interesting to see how subtle it is, and it shows up in really small ways, where you make a decision and then there's doubt. "Oh, I should have done that. Why would you where does that come from? And it comes from this discomfort of not knowing what the right way to get, to do life is, because we won't know. We'll never know. But having the story that there is a right way to do it somewhere, and it's not active and it doesn't play out in every single part of our lives, but I think it does in most of the things that we do in life, that we do have this kind of like outline far off in the distance of what it should look like and how it looks like to move towards it, and realizing that that is there more than um I think what the big insight for me was that if I got it right, I wouldn't know it, because I don't know
Oh,
what right looks like, right? Like, it's so far away, it's so nebulous, it changes so much, it's so dependent on my mood and who's around and, what stage of my life. It I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know a right good life if it, like, hit me over the head. And just knowing that was really freeing. Like, "Oh, I'm hustling towards this perfection, but I don't even know what that perfection looks like. It never will." So,
mhm.
yeah.
And we can, I mean, we can kind I reflect that we can see that that's the case because, eh, we move the goalposts move all the time, we can even
Mm,
have a moment where we feel like, "Oh, I did it right," and yet there's still that chasing feeling there, that yearning, to get it right. So, obviously, it's not actually a thing, being able to
yeah,
do it right. Because if it was, and we did something right, we would feel that, you know? Yeah.
yeah. And for me, what flipped it for me was I think in the self-help world, we hear a lot of like, "Well, you can't get it wrong.
Mm,
Do what you gotta do, and you just get life doesn't get it wrong." And for me, that was like there was this connotation, like my mind would finish the sentence and say, "Well, then everything is right." Right? If I can't get it wrong, then anything that happens is right. And this was like the I want I there was this movement away from the concepts of right and wrong in its totality, right? Because my mind was always gonna get the other half of it, right? Like, it was gonna try to complete, that sentence, and when I was like, "Well, I can't get it wrong, sure, but I also can't get it right, because there's no such thing." And that just kinda collapsed the whole, the both concepts for me, and there was just this freedom that I hadn't found before, in that kind of disappearance of that as a concept that I wanted that felt like I was striving towards.
yeah. Oh, I'm glad you shared that. That's such a good distinction to make, that the whole thing collapses when we realize, there is no wrong or right. Neither
Yeah,
one exists. Yeah.
yeah. Like, who's
Yeah.
keeping score of that, right?
Right, right, yes. Yeah, exactly. God, I wish, I had discovered this years ago because in my, I guess, 30s especially, I really struggled to accept that I didn't wanna fit into a mold. I felt like there was this mold, especially around work, that I was supposed to fit into, and I didn't, and so then I felt like I was doing it wrong all the time. And, yeah, the permission to just be myself would have been so helpful in
Yeah.
hindsight.
Yeah, for me, actually, this insight came to me around parenting,
Ah.
and there was this like, "Okay, well, what if I can't get it right?" And I don't know, I mean, most people who have older kids, I have smaller children, who still like love me and adore me. We haven't hit the teenage years with the resistance yet, but I know some amazing parents who their kids are like, "Nope, no, you did it all wrong."
Mm.
And I just remember playing with that, like, what if I can never get it right when it comes to parenting? It's always going to be through the lens of them, right? And their freedom to interpret regardless of my motives, my motivation, my anything. They're gonna conclude whatever they're gonna conclude, right, about these interactions. So if I hustle and try to get it right, then that's kind of a losing battle. And I was like, what if I never can? How do I show up as a parent, as a mother, day in and day out, not trying to get it right, but trying to just be with what's showing up in that moment and just really tracking true to the
Mm.
experience that's showing up without that like need for continuity, right? Of like, how do I become the kind of parent that does it right? So
Mhm. Oh, wow, that's really great. Yeah, as you say, liberating was the word you used.
yeah.
Yeah. Wow, amazing. So now I would like to quote you back to yourself. This is a quote from one of your blog posts. All life needs as me is here now. So can you talk about that a little bit and what you mean?
Yeah. I think what that means for me listening back to it is really about the wisdom of the immediate moment, however it's showing up.
Mm,
And you get a second behind it and a second ahead of it, and you're judging it and you're, like, no, this is wrong, should have been different. And but the the moment that's showing up for us right now is the culmination of everything that's happened before, what we remember, what we understand, what our bodies have felt, and really leaning into the fact that this mind will never know everything that came together to culminate in this moment. But I have the best proof that it is exactly what life needed it to be because it's what's showing up. And to me, it can be a mental analysis of like, okay, yeah, things were meant to be. And it can be this kind of settling that's very humbling because in that place, we're really vulnerable because it's really a complete um surrender. It's a complete surrender to what's showing up, the good, the bad, and the ugly, what we want to change the next moment, what we're going to regret, when we come to. But there's just this kind of like liminal space before all that shows up that I think we know just that perfection.
mhm. And so given that a lot of our listeners are dealing with an overeating habit, then could you put put what you've just said in the context of having a craving, and a desire to overeat?
Yeah. Oh, this is funny because this actually came up yesterday for me around cravings, and had I had a good laugh about it after I kind of came to, and I was fighting a craving. I shouldn't. I should. Da, 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 all the noise, and in the immediate moment of giving into the craving, all I said was, "Oh, this feels so good." And it was the most honest thing I had said to myself in such a long time.
Mm,
That giving into that craving felt good. And of course, I'm going to do it if it feels good, right? Like that was the part where I was like, duh, right? Like I'm trying to make a big deal out of like, oh, what do I still want this? And it was so simple for me in that moment. What did
mhm,
I have it? Because I wanted it and I liked it when I had it. And then the next moment, a lot more information came to me. Hmm, interesting. Why do I like this so much? But it was coming, it was like I was like driving And all of a sudden I let the, when you drive and you just kind of look at the other parts of the map and then you kind of lose where you are and your GPS is still going, but like you don't know where you are. You're like, where's the dot? And then you recalibrate, you press that button that centers the whole GPS. Like that's what it did. All of a sudden, being honest in the moment with what was showing up for me, regardless of whether I liked it or not, reoriented me
Mm,
into, oh, I'm here. I'm here. And then I felt this wave of openness into, okay, now you're here. Where do we go next? Now that you are oriented, now that you know, where do we go next with what you've known, not mentally, not through my judgment, but fully, physically embodied, knowing in that moment that that craving and giving into it felt good. Does that
mm.
make sense?
It does, I do.
This just happened like 12 hours ago, so I'm like processing it as we're talking through it.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think it's such a good point to be reminded about is that we're always, well, this is one thing I got from what you say, is that we're always wanting a good feeling,
Mhm.
and we're always wanting to connect with, yeah, a good feeling. So it's perfectly natural that we treat ourselves to some sort of food because it does feel good. And I just get so much out of the fact that demonizing that takes us way away from what's actually happening.
Yeah. Well, demonizing I feel like it interrupts what's happening, right?
Mm,
So if you're I think a lot of us have this experience, which I find it bizarre, but it's so common for a lot of us, which is as you're eating it, as you're eating something, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I'm eating this. I shouldn't be eating this. And you're still, you're still the action is happening. It's almost like this out of body experience, like I'm not liking it. And there's this conflict, right? And I feel like in the conflict, and when we're so in our heads about the conflict of we're either in the conflict of doing it or in the planning of how we're not going to do it again, right? Like we're
yes.
but in either of those cases, we're not present
Mhm,
with the information that we're getting in that moment as to why that action is taking place.
mhm,
And that to me is kind of going back and pointing to the immediacy of the moment as where all the wisdom is. It's not in the plan that comes out of it. It's not in the regret. It's in that moment. Um, what is showing up fully, um, including then the judgment and all of that may come later.
mhm. Yeah, yeah. And given, we just talked about presence and what life needs from us. So eh, I'm sort of trying to connect the dots with those two things, and the awareness that's within us. We're not our thoughts, like we talked about at the beginning. We're not our thoughts, we're not our feelings, we're not our behaviors. Um, and I don't have a question, but I can just feel myself sort of, yeah, bringing those things together.
Yeah. I think about that seamlessness of life, right?
Mm,
Like when we can when we can be in the immediacy of the moment without the need for the memory of who we are and who we should be and need to be, and we can be in the immediacy of the body as it seems to move through this environment, then all of it kind of comes together. The thinking, the feeling, like there aren't all those separations. And to me, that is um what's always happening, right? I think we are always that seamless movement of life that
mm,
is in itself the culmination of life moment to moment, right? Not towards something, not because it has an agenda, not because it's moving towards that perfect next, but it's just the aliveness, right? The arising of aliveness exactly as it shows up.
mhm. Yeah, and I guess with my brain, I just spend so much time trying to control that rather than just letting it happen. I'm sure I'm not alone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there is this w we'll go back and forth, like, sometimes we're like, "Oh, we're I'm really trying to control this," and then you realize, like, can I control it?" Like, that's the question when I was like, "Well, what if I just let go?" I was like, "Well, you wasn't doing much in the first place, so how about then you start being more willing to try it when in small ways you see like, "Oh, I wasn't driving this bus anyway." Um, little by little, you're like, "Oh, okay. What else can I let go? What can I be softer around? What
Mhm.
else is none of my business here?" Right? That I could just kind of be easier around and yeah. And it's easier to do in certain parts of our lives, I think, when it comes to like our big kind of graspy issue, it's hard to do that. But playing around with it where the stakes feel low, I love starting there. Because then it becomes a felt sense. Then you don't need to know it or kind of point to it or have a method for it. Is more of a way that your body, like your system, wants to show up around the experiences.
Mhm. And I love that's such a good reminder, to play with this where the stakes feel low.
Mhm.
And, yeah, for someone who's struggling with overeating, that might not be the place to begin, but there are other places in our life where we can just play with this and see
Yeah.
what
I mean,
happens.
there's something so incredible about eating and food being what brings us to this conversation.
Mm.
I sometimes for some people it feels trivial, like, "Oh, really? It's food for me?" Like some people have like relationship issues or and then on the other side it's in our face day in and day out. Food is so integral to life itself. And when I I'm just always in awe of the people who come through this conversation through the portal of food and eating disorders because it's such an um it takes over our lives in such a amazing way. And I think there is a beautiful opportunity in how all encompassing coming to this through food can be, and a lot of compassion that is where it feels like we're fighting nature or survival, or there's so many stories that we come to the table with when we're expanding through this lens of food.
Mhm. Oh, thank you for saying that. That was really beautifully said. I appreciate that. So, as we get sort of closer to the end of our time together, is there anything you'd like to share that we haven't talked about yet today?
um no, I think what I would share is that really there's going to be kind of this battleground for this expansion and this conversation, right? Like we're talking about food for some people, money for others, and that's going to have its tightness and its resistance and a lot of these qualities. And then there could be a playground next to that battleground
Mhm.
where we can explore in a playful way some of these things that we are learning, right, through our experiences, and just being able to say, "Ah, let me just play. Let me see what I see, because it doesn't matter. Let me be curious. Let me be the child who kind of takes this thing apart, because it doesn't matter. I'm not going to break it. I'm not." And just kind of holding those two things, right? Like, yes, some things are going to feel like a battleground, but then be curious about where is that playground where you can expand um in more softer supported way. And then you'll see that spoiler alert, it's the same thing. It's just
Right.
one thing, but just making a conscious effort to bring that compassion and that softness into, a lot of the inquiry that we bring in this conversation.
Lovely. Thank you for that. So, Alex, where can we find out more about you and your work?
Yes, you can find me on Instagram. You can find me on my website, kanaimacoaching.com. So that's CANAIMA coaching.com, and kanaimacoaching at gmail.com. Message me any questions, any comments. Would love to hear from you.
Perfect. And you also have a podcast with Amanda Jones.
Sure do. The Wonderland comes out every Wednesday at 3:14 AM. Yeah, so, Amanda Jones and I have been, recorded our 45th episode today, for the Wonderland. Just a lot more of this exploration, very, kind of dreamy, open format. I hope people who join and listen to us get to daydream along with us. So, yeah, give it a listen.
Nice. Okay, great. Thank you so much for being here with me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Alexandra.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.